They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy.
You know what I miss a lot? The handheld market. We got so much nice stuff out of those little things, even if they were often not that great. Often handheld or portable games asked for a lot of ingenuity on the part of their developers. Trying to fit a game into that small package was probably not that much fun. Only a few of those games remain now, and of all of them, there's one that really makes no sense. If you had told Capcom, one of the largest Japanese developers, that they would make a game about a goofy-ass attorney and his nonsense escapades, and that would become a staple of their brand, and that it started on a handheld, now they'd have laughed you out of the room between sips of their overpriced whiskey. But of course, they'd be the fools then, because there's just something about Ace Attorney. Ace Attorney would probably have been a tough sell if Shu Takumi fielded to some desk jockey at Capcom. That's how most games probably get their start, and how most end up in the trash. But Ace Attorney never suffered that. In reality, the development of Ace Attorney started with, of all things, Dino Crisis.
Of Resident Evil. Dino Crisis.
Takumi, or Takumi, however you say it, was tapped to direct stuff like Dino Crisis at Capcom to mixed results. Those games have a cult following now, but back in the day they were kinda just there. At their most basic, they're just Resident Evil games done with dinosaurs. They're not really that complicated. Takumi, though, didn't really want to make them. He wanted to make his own games, which requires a little bit of an explanation as to why he'd even assume that. There was, for a time, and perhaps still to this day, a phenomenon in Japanese games development where people who worked for the companies would just get told, okay, you get to make a game now. You didn't even need to have a lot of experience with them, per se. You didn't need to have a high-up management position or be friends with the CEO. You didn't need to steal other people's projects. You just, at some point, might get the opportunity to come up with an idea for a game and then make it. Lots of games got their start this way. Titles like Guilty Gear, Metal Gear, and Suda51's early work would fall into this category. For Capcom, you could easily trace it back to something like Mega Man 2, where it was developed at the behest of the original game's developers who thought they could make a better game, which they did. Takumi was offered his big chance in the smallest way possible. According to him, he only had 6 months to make something with a team of 7-ish people, which is kind of insane, given that it would be a whole new title from the ground up. Luckily, Takumi already had an idea. In fact, it was what attracted him to the company in the first place. I thought, now is my chance to write that mystery game I always wanted to. The reason I originally entered the games industry was so that one day I could make that type of game. When I first started looking for a job, I was really hoping to enter a publishing house that handled mystery novels, but for better or worse, it wasn't meant to be. His idea was pretty simple, a game about an attorney who fights the good fight for his clients. It'd be an earnest take on a mystery game with a unique twist. The mystery elements would be in service to the legal argumentation that would take place in a court. And best of all, he was going to do it not on a big home console, but on a handheld. People really forgot this vestige of games, but the handheld market was often one of the most innovative for its time. Pretty impressive to shrink down your hardware into a small portable package. For a time, they were used to port over older games, or for spin-offs and gimmicks, but that quickly faded as actual titles started to get released. Games like Pokemon were designed for the express purpose of being handheld games, while other titles like Persona or fellow Capcom property Monster Hunter would use them to great benefit. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney released for the Game Boy Advance, not that most of us would have actually realized it. See, in the US, most everyone actually played its re-release form on the DS, which, in all honesty, is the superior experience. Still though, plenty of elements from the original 3 games could be found in their later releases. For example, the simple color palette and heavy use of grayscale for things like photos or evidence was a result of hardware limitations on the Advance. For example, because the illustrations in the original used 8-bit color, we realized that making the entire game color would mean the game data would be too large. But if we used the 16 colors needed for monochrome, the data it took would only be a quarter of that amount. So we ended up making all the evidence photos and memory scenes monochrome. Ace Attorney never really hit its stride until those DS releases, where most people actually got to play them. What they got was some of the best gameplay and narratives the genre has ever seen, and they've yet to be fully recognized or even understood by many. Which really should not have happened. I mean, come on, a lawyer?
Care to join me in a bout of scotch?
Have you actually tried watching a court case? They're not exactly thrilling, but that's kind of the genius of it. Ace Attorney is taking something that otherwise wouldn't be very interesting and turning it into something that is, making for an extremely unique experience compared to other mystery-type games. I mean, what, you gonna trot out Nancy Drew or something? Can these even be considered games? Anyways, the games were popular enough to at least get a port to the DS, alongside some other spin-offs and a whole trilogy that honestly wasn't that good. We'll talk about it, don't worry. All from one guy's fun idea and 6 months of painstaking work. They pulled this stuff off faster than most actual trials. Now there's something that needs to be clarified here. Ace Attorney is not a visual novel, and anyone who claims that is simply wrong. Visual novels are exactly what they say on the tin. They are novels in a visual form, which means there is minimal, if any, player input.
The intro thing is taking forever and it's getting pretty boring to me. Someone said, wear your fedora. Okay, I'll be right back. Hold on, gamers.
They lack mechanical gameplay outside of clicking next on a screen or occasionally picking some mediocre dialogue.
Everyone in chat, press 1 if you think this music is chill.
Visual novels also lack fail states, which result from player error, which requires gameplay, which they don't have that. Ace Attorney does have gameplay, does have meaningful player input, does have fail states, and yet it still gets called a visual novel. It's not. Now please stop embarrassing yourself. Ace Attorney's gameplay is actually pretty innovative, as it combines your more typical mystery game adventuring and sleuthing with a much more exciting and fairly difficult set of logic problems and critical thinking once you're in the courtroom. You are playing as Phoenix Wright, after all. He's not some private eye with a penchant for solving crimes, not some hard-boiled detective. If anything, he's sunny side up, or scrambled. Since the game solely relies on critical thinking with just a dash of adventure game nonsense, you'll quickly come to realize that Ace Attorney's gameplay becomes much more intertwined with its characters and narratives than nearly any other game of its type. Puzzles and problems aren't presented as such. They're shown to you through the limited framework of a defense attorney, which often means you're out of the loop on what is actually going on. Instead, you're tasked with reasoning out what you can, based on evidence. You won't be stumbling into the answers very often, and if you do, there's a decent chance they were planted there in the narrative to trick you. Try presenting that autopsy report. I'm sure Prosecutor Edgeworth doesn't have anything to say about that. You're on your own when you're trying to win the case, and that's really the hard part. You may very well be able to figure out what actually happened. In fact, you absolutely will, often before you even reach your final court date. But can you prove it? See? Suddenly this whole attorney idea doesn't sound so bland. Poor Phoenix and co. can't present their evidence and prove what happened. They're trapped within the strict confines of the law and the rules of the court. You're on the defensive here, not the offense. The prosecution is the one with all the agency here, and of course they've got a few tricks up their sleeves too. Court always becomes a hopeless quagmire, whether at the beginning, middle, or the end. The court system doesn't favor you. In fact, that is partly the impetus for the game's idea in the first place. Ever wonder why the court system in the games is so weird? Like it's clearly favoring the state? Well, that's because it absolutely is. Ace Attorney's court system is loosely based off the Japanese court system, where the courts literally have a 99% conviction rate. This isn't fair, and that's the point. Takumi envisioned the game having this feeling, that you're kinda screwed and that the prosecution has you dead to rights. It's pretty easy to make them into antagonists simply because they have such a ludicrous advantage. It's not even that they're bad guys, they're just doing their job and have the institutional backing to do it. But that's no excuse, is it? You're not here to whine and complain that the court is unfair, that the judge is biased, that the prosecution has the edge. You're here to defend your client. There's one thing that you have that everyone else doesn't. You have the truth. And all it takes is one little misstep, one little flub from a witness, from a detective or the prosecution, and you can finally let loose one stunning OBJECTION! He said it! And bam! Suddenly everything changes. The music begins to pick up, the shocked expressions of your opponents are juxtaposed with Phoenix's burst of confidence. The prosecution throws back a retort, but there's plenty more debate still to come. I'm willing to bet that it was coming upon that idea of shouting out your small victories that really made the game click. Now it's not just you talking at each other in court. It becomes an exciting spectacle. You're combing through evidence and testimony so you can lay out that iconic line while bringing your client that much closer to freedom. Not that it's easy, mind you. These games are excellently written, and it's hard to really describe them in mechanical terms because so much of it relies on such unusual gameplay. It's a deduction game. You must deduce things based on the flawed perspectives of others, or worse, from the perspectives of someone who's outright lying to the court. And there's lots of little things that make it work. For example, there's often these sudden flashes and camera shakes to emphasize impact, close-ups with speed lines to show the ferocity of the debate, the wide shots of the court in disarray, and of course the smash cuts to the judge's gavel trying to bring back order to the proceedings. It's actively using perspective to give a much grander view of what's going on, whether you're in court or on the hunt for clues. It's managed to inject some real fire into what would otherwise be a bunch of sprites just pointing at each other. It's the proper synchronization of all the elements of the game to make it become something really special. Take the art and animation, for instance. Just by looking at a character, you can almost instantly gauge their personality, their manner of speech, their everything, really. From the huffing and puffing Detective Gumshoe, to the more laid-back poses of Maya Fey, and of course the stars of the show, the actual attorneys. For the animation and art, it's all about perspective, creating both the impression of depth in their designs, while making animation snappy and expressive. The pointing thing is just obvious. It's iconic enough to make it onto the cover, for crying out loud. And again, it comes back to the perspective that's used. You might not realize it, but you're playing the game mostly from a first-person perspective. You're supposed to literally be seeing what Phoenix is when you're not in court. But when you are, the camera jumps out into the middle of the courtroom and swivels about to get a shot of the action. From the witness stand, it goes left to the defense's desk, and to the right is the prosecution. The judge sits behind the camera and has to turn and look up at him since he's in a raised position. There's a real flow to the camera movements, and they blend incredibly well with each character's surprisingly limited range of animations. The flow it creates gives the feeling of an exciting chase or something, an action-packed romp through the courtroom using 2D sprites that don't even really move. When they do though, there's a lot of attention to detail that remains pretty consistent to this day. Even though the games have swapped to 3D models, they still maintain the same rules for posing and animations. Characters remain in as readable a perspective as possible, while still making use of camera movement. Really, they were at their best in Apollo Justice, a game that is actually pretty bad by Ace Attorney standards, and yet visually it's kind of stunning. The animations are outrageously good, and you could slow them down to see even the most minute details have been adjusted for. Even once the games made the jump to 3D, a controversial decision to say the least, they still maintain most of their quality. The designs themselves never suffered, but especially in the first 3D title, Dual Destinies, the new animations were just a little off, among other things. Apollo Justice, Dual Destinies, and Spirit of Justice were the last three mainline titles, and they're not really as good as the original trilogy. But thankfully, they were redeemed by a spin-off that nobody really could have expected. The Great Ace Attorney is pretty good, mostly. It makes better use of court time compared to the other 3D games which waffle about thanks to some unnecessary additions, and instead expanded upon the excellent system of having multiple witnesses and jurors the player must appease. It makes the court even more chaotic than it already was, as well as putting the player on the back foot even more, since they're opposed by like 10 people all at once. Those victories are just as triumphant as the original games, and are a shockingly good return to form. I'd also be remiss not to mention the investigation games, a pair of spin-offs that are also pretty cool, though they're a lot different from normal Ace Attorney games. It plays like a much more traditional detective game, albeit with an Ace Attorney twist. You still need to argue, you still need to collect and present evidence, but it's just framed differently within the narrative. Aside from that though, not too much changes. Something else that thankfully never changed was the quality of the game's soundtracks. The series soundtracks are some of the best you could get from the handheld market, as well as most games in general. They came at this funny time in music composition where most 8-bit tracks were phased out since better hardware was available, but you still needed to do it for handhelds. By then though, composers knew all the tricks to make it sound good. Really good, in fact. And so that's exactly what they did. Ace Attorney tracks can broadly be separated into two types. You have investigation tracks and court tracks, which really speak for themselves. During investigations, you're treated to a wider variety of styles and ideas, usually in the form of character themes, with the occasional area theme sprinkled in. Here's just a few. They're obviously meant to represent their particular characters, and though not everyone gets one, they're common enough to make several pretty iconic. There are also actual area themes and investigation tracks for when you're engaging in some good old-fashioned sleuthing. But let's be honest, these tracks sort of take a backseat to what everyone's really here for. It's the courtroom tracks that really show the strength of the series. Every day at court starts with the court theme, each track showing off the grand importance of the space. They set the tone for the rest of the proceedings. They're very official and formal, and they present some calm before the storm of argumentation begins. There are testimony and cross-examination tracks, taking elements from the investigation themes by creating tension and mystery as you comb through witness statements and evidence. Then finally, when you find a contradiction and object, the objection theme starts. These and the subsequent pursuit themes are probably the most well-known tracks from these games. Now that you've caught a witness in the act, you're rewarded with the tension rising and the music bringing the drab proceedings to a new level. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's the pursuit themes, otherwise known as the shit is getting real songs. They're the fastest ones, which play when you're close to the truth, or at least when you think you're close to it. Also, basically all the pursuit tracks have this maddeningly cool variation where instead of the track beginning normally, they begin with these steep, sudden chords to emphasize the speed. The soundtracks are universally excellent, and each one had their own unique soundtrack for investigations and court themes up until the 3D titles. And even then, the 3D titles still have very good music, just now it sounds like actual instrumentation. You could argue you lose something with that, but at the same time, one simply can't imagine the great Ace Attorney without having its more realistic soundscape for the music. Funnily enough, there is one song that they never needed to change throughout the series, not counting character themes of course, and that's the suspense music. This track shows up a lot, and it's pretty spooky when it does. Really, the music is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here to keep the game's pace going smoothly. You'd think court isn't really the place for music, but without it, the game would be outrageously bland and unappealing. It plays into the cartoony nature of the world as well. These cases are often ridiculous and absurd, so it only makes sense that at times the music would serve to accentuate that. But remember, at the same time it's still relying on the presentation as well. Both elements need to be in sync for any of this to work. And it's probably why a lot of games like Ace Attorney don't really meet that standard. Everything needs to be correct every single time to make sure that Phoenix strikes a pose at the right moment, with the music cueing right when it needs to, so that both narratively and mechanically it feels like you've triumphed. Which brings us to yet another vital element of the series. Ace Attorney lives and dies by its characters. They're essentially the entire point of the games themselves. You can't have Ace Attorney without good characters, and likewise, you can't have good characters without starting with the star litigator himself, Phoenix Wright. Phoenix could best be described as a doughy everyman with a real knack for legal work. The games walk a fine line between giving him so much character that you can't relate to him, with also making him a blank enough slate so you can still play as him without needing to join some weird RP group. A lot of the time he's actually pretty impotent. His more milquetoast personality is one that many of the more exaggerated characters are happy to walk all over. But when he's in the courtroom, suddenly he's a different animal entirely. He's expressive and confident until he's brought back to earth by the prosecution or a clever witness. but it never gets him down. He'll bounce back just fine with the help of the player and his trusty partner. Maya Fey falls into the assistant role, which sort of became a trope for this series, and she sets an excellent precedent. She's happy-go-lucky and a little childish, but beaming with emotion and creativity. She's a spirit medium with a heart of gold, and her animations emphasize that. Even though she has a reputation for continually getting accused of murders she didn't commit, she's never actually that much of a burden, and it's her and Wright's relationship which keeps him going in many cases. It's her optimism that brings him out of his slumps, and her genuine attitude that keeps him endeared to her more eccentric tendencies. She calls him Nick instead of Phoenix, a term that was supposed to be reserved for his old school friend Larry, but I think Phoenix kinda likes it. It's her unique perspective which usually keeps the game from sliding too far into being overly serious, and of course it's her that Phoenix cares about because of their adventures and his respect for her late sister, Mia Fey. Mia is, or rather was, a
single female lawyer fighting for her client, wearing sexy miniskirts and being self-reliant.
Until she was murdered in the second case of the game. That's not a spoiler, it literally happens like 2 hours in, get over it. Anyway, she's dead, but the Fey family are conveniently a long-spanning line of spirit mediums, so Maya can actually just summon her spirit back to do some talking. Mia is the mentor of Phoenix, in the sense that she's the one he originally worked for and does her best to help him when he's at his lowest. She never goes too far as to overshadow him, and she's very much her own character, given that the third game features her heavily. So heavily, in fact, you actually get to play as her, new sprites and all. And what's more, her guidance ends once Phoenix's arc concludes in the third game, meaning that she doesn't overstay her welcome. Her story ends with Phoenix becoming the lawyer he's aspired to be, and there's something really beautiful about that. And you know what else I need to get to? The guy everyone who's played these games has been waiting for me to mention. The star prosecutor himself, Miles Edgeworth. Edgeworth is the first real prosecutor and main antagonist of the series, and I'm gonna put a big asterisk next to antagonist, because I mean it in the most technical sense. Miles has his own arc going on through the trilogy, which sees him go from a cold-hearted prosecutor to a slightly less cold-hearted but still fairly cynical one. The two are perfect frenemies, with the pair playing off one another perfectly. When Phoenix is losing, Miles is being a confident, pompous ass, bowing with his gay little cravat and unironically using words like ergo. But when the opposite is the case, it's Phoenix who's taking charge, pointing aggressively and smirking when he has the advantage, while Miles is grinding his teeth and trying to find anything he can do to salvage his case. Edgeworth usually shows up at the end of games now to be the surprise prosecutor, or just to generally be a cool dude. You even get to play as him in the third game as well, not to mention the investigation games. What's nice though is that repeating characters isn't usually something the game does without reason. They always strive to add new prosecutors and witnesses, and that's what makes the cases so much more engaging. It's the cavalcade of weirdos you meet to help make the mundane premise not so boring. Not to mention that the amount of effort it had to have taken to include so many characters, to write unique dialogue for each of them, creating their various sprites, maybe even giving them a theme, is more than you could say for a lot of games, let alone a silly mystery title that was supposed to play a backseat amongst Capcom's IPs. But that's the magic of it. These games were never really expected to go anywhere, at least by Capcom brass. When you give a project 6 months to be finished, you're probably not expecting it to do well. But if your devs actually care, if they go through the effort to make new characters and music, then suddenly you can do anything. Kinda reminds me of someone. That brings us to the last bit of what makes an Ace Attorney game then, the story and setting within the cases. Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about Ace Attorney is its tone and the overarching characterization throughout the games. Ace Attorney is not, and for the most part, has never been a particularly serious series of games. They were always at their core a rather silly caricature of a legal system, rather than anything too serious. And so the cases always had to mirror that to some degree. Despite the fact that most of the games deal with crime, murder, and all that jazz, they're still remarkably positive experiences. That's partly why the second trilogy of the games stumbles so much compared to the first. It started taking itself just a little too seriously, when it would have been better off actually tackling fun cases that had lower stakes. Apollo Justice and Phoenix's adoptive daughter Trucy are pretty great, but because of the tumultuous development of the second trilogy, they ended up doing some silly things like giving Apollo 3 different backstories, none of which really meld together at all that well. And yet, aside from some more larger scale missteps, Ace Attorney has been one of the most endearing yet simple worlds and plots you can ask for, and I think that's what brings the entire series together as you get more invested in it. First, I want to point out that the games actually take place in real time. That is to say that the games count the time between each release as having actually happened, which means characters age and change in tandem with reality. Not many games do something like this, but for Ace Attorney, it's important to make the characters feel more real. If you're going to spend so much time with them, then you need to take them seriously in the sense that you could tangibly relate to them. At the same time, the world, and I use that term kinda loosely, of Ace Attorney is this funky fusion of Japan and America, courtesy of localization. If you're playing the Japanese version, then it takes place in Japan, but if you're playing it in English, it takes place in America. It creates this kind of weirdo setting where you're in a fairly modern city and then 2 hours outside of it there's a traditional Japanese village, and everyone's wearing kimonos and stuff. People call it Japanifornia, which should tell you how seriously you should be taking it. It's America, but funny. Don't worry too much. Every game has individual cases that aren't directly related alongside an overarching story in the background that culminates in the final case. This helps make sure that the devs have an excuse to make characters and situations that don't need to service a larger story, meaning that world in general could be made bigger and more expansive than the simplified perspective would have you believe. Naturally, the final cases are always the most exciting, and consistently seek to upend the typical Ace Attorney formula by doing stuff like making the prosecutor German. I hate those guys. Oh, but not her. I never hate her. How about where you play these games where the defendant is always supposed to be innocent, and then suddenly he's just not? How does Phoenix rationalize that in the face of actively implicating someone who didn't do it? Or even better, let's put Phoenix in the hospital and let the player play as Edgeworth for a bit, where we get to see his inner thoughts the way we saw Phoenix's. Now, I have just spoiled the final cases of some of the games. Sorry, by the way. But when I do say that, you should realize that these games need to be played first before you actually get to talk about them. By their nature as mystery games, you need to experience it yourself instead of me just telling you about it. Anyways, it's these cases and more which do ratchet up the tension and tone. These are when the stakes are dire, and when you need to get serious. But the game never loses its happy-go-lucky attitude around anything else. Characters remain just as silly, court remains just as over the top, and the outcomes are almost always positive, or at least bittersweet. That's because Ace Attorney is about one very relatable, human thing. It's about struggling against the odds. Ace Attorney, the game, is itself that story. It should have been like how the Game Boy commercial said.
They said it wasn't humanly possible.
It's a game that never should have been good, never should have taken off, and never should have gotten past the trends of the time. But it came at just the right moment when you could make a game with 7 very talented people, where you could do it through sheer willpower and determination. They unleashed their creativity onto the courtroom and turned it into a wacky parody of law that still carries the spirit of what justice is supposed to be about. Every time Phoenix gets that not guilty verdict, it's not just him who wins, it's you. It's Shu Takumi and those crazy bastards, huddled in their cubicles around the clock, trying to make this little game about people pointing and yelling at each other. And just like how Phoenix managed to become a great attorney and a great friend to so many people, Takumi and his team beat the odds to make some great games that left an impression no other title like it can. It's about endearment in the end, that by combining the exacting gameplay, excellent visuals and style, the music and the characters, the cases themselves all coming together not to make a buck off you, not to regale you with some epic high-stakes adventure, not to talk down to you or belittle or tell you what to think about. It asks you to trust these characters and the world they live in to be real, just like how Phoenix trusts his clients. And look where that trust got him in his games. Now he's a Capcom headliner. Sometimes. Hey, Capcom ain't perfect, and they can be blamed for mishandling their IPs just like everyone else. But to think that little Game Boy turned DS game made it this far, cementing itself in the world of games so strongly with so little support, that's just damn good design, no doubt about it. And now that Ace Attorney is on PC, everyone's finally starting to really give Right & Co a chance. For better or worse, I'm happy that these moments these games shared with me can be shared with others, because they really mean something. After all, there's just something about Ace Attorney.
Objection!
Sorry state we're in.
Oh my god, look at all this fucking... You seriously think I'm gonna read that? Someone said music's too loud. Okay, well, whatever.